My guest today is John Dale Dunn.
Well, basically, we're going to talk about human health and the climate change issues that have been raised by the IPCC and what amounts to 30 years of environmentalism. Um, I originally got involved in this as a faculty member of the local college. I taught environmental law because they found out that I was a lawyer and I was a physician at the local emergency department, and I had a what you might call an externship arrangement with their students that wanted to be doctors in the emergency department so they could watch to see what happened. And so I got to know the dean of sciences, and she asked me to teach environmental law to the students who were taking a major in environmental activities. They wanted to be managers and scientists and regulators. And I taught that to the students and the local businessmen who were concerned about trying to be compliant with environmental laws. And from that point on, in the early 90s, I really got involved in looking at what the EPA was doing in air pollution. And climate was a secondary interest, but it continued to be an interest even till today. I got involved with the Heartland Institute in the later in the 90s, and the Heritage later even than that. And I've written papers for them and done research on what amounts to my area of interest, which is, does warming really cause any kind of risk for the human population or the biosphere? And that's always been fun because the environmentalists have created a scare that actually can't be supported by the science.
You've been an emergency physician for over 50 years and an attorney admitted to the bars of Nebraska, Louisiana, and Texas by examination. So your background is pretty impressive.
Well, it means that I could take some tests, right?
Yeah.
And, and I always took it seriously. I never practiced law or represented clients. I was interested in the law as it relates to what you might call government and civics. And as you know, as an American, there is no legal system that's as good as ours. And I always thought, well, it'd be interesting to learn how it all got started and how it got formed. And so I went to law school for fun when I was on the faculty at the medical school at Creighton. And they let me in without even taking an exam. It was kind of like courtesy. And it took me 4 years to get through law school, but I had an active medical practice. And so I had to do it around my medical practice. And then it took a little bit longer, but I became a lawyer in 79. I was a doctor from 71 on. And the combination made me just perfect for the kind of work that is related to looking at the environmental issues and the activities of the EPA, because the EPA has been in the business of pushing a regulatory regime that was based on what you might call fundamental toxicology. What they try to do is they try to establish, well, there's something we need to regulate because the toxicological research shows that if we don't regulate it, it'll be harmful to the human race. So unfortunately, most people that are involved in the issues are scientists who have an interest in meteorology or astrophysics. But the real political game is let's find something that we can say is a risk to the human race, and then let's regulate the hell out of the activities that produce this risk. And toxicology is the game. That makes sense?
It totally does make sense. And I should share that I went to several Heartland meetings over the years, and I saw you speak at least once. And you were one of my favorite speakers because you're a clear communicator and you have this ability to talk about reality, not just the modeled world, but what's really going on out there. I love it.
Yeah, well, one of the things about being a biologist, it's just so that biologists do not. We're not into physics. We're into observational science. Um, I hate math. I hate calculus in particular, but you can talk common sense in the area of biology because it's about observational science and research. We don't really know how living organisms do all the things that they do. We have some information on it, but it's not about what you'd call deep into the weeds science. It's about studying things that are living and are functional. And so I was a perfect match. I didn't like calculus, but I did like science, and I like the method because the method is the way that the civilization advances. And unfortunately, the EPA hijacked the method and put junk science into a position where it allowed them to propose to the politicians that if we don't regulate this, then we're going to harm all these people. There will be death and destruction across the planet, and it's all nonsense. I mean, this planet is nowhere close to the kind of simple, stupid things that the EPA wants to tell the politicians justify the regulations.
Yeah, so you haven't spent a lot of time dealing with the math and trying to figure out how the climate really works, but you've done an enormous amount of is cold weather better for us than hot weather, right? You've looked into that. You've written.
Well, that's where it starts. Yeah. And when you're dealing with the air pollution, where it starts is the fact that they stole epidemiology and tried to create epidemiological studies that show that air pollution kill people, air pollution does this and that. They don't have the research. And in fact, sometimes they did crazy things to try to prove all of the air pollutants were so dangerous, but they're not. In the case of warming and global climate change, which they added on because they found out that they needed to do more to deal with the question of what is the climate, and they could make more scares out of climate changes because we're always dealing with, terrible events like hurricanes and floods and heat waves. So you could get people's attention by making a deal about it. And what they did essentially was kind of gin up a scaremonger routine that started with Hansen in the late 80s with regards to air pollution, but then that moved over and went to climate and trying to make a crisis out of anthropogenic production of carbon dioxide. Oh, it's a terrible thing, and here I am blowing out 4% CO2 air into the environment. That's 40,000 parts per million, okay? In the ambient air that's around us, there are 400 parts per million, a little bit more now. And they're trying to say that amount of carbon dioxide is enough to make the whole planet boil over. Al Gore was the perfect spokesman for that kind of thing. Point at the big screen and say, look, the sea levels will rise 30 feet and bury all the cities in water. What a joke. So it's been fun, but the problem is the media and government paid researchers have those of us who are trying to make good sense out of studying the climate, a minority, a small minority. When government money gets involved in research, it makes the agenda. And that's what you're trying to work on, is to try to see how we can push back on what amounts to government research money created crises and scares.
So one thing I saw you push back hard against is the whole idea of the precautionary principle. Am I right?
Oh, and, the precautionary principle is the mindset of what I would call immature adults. Everybody can be scared of stuff, but when it comes down to it, life is always involves some risks. And when you make the precautionary principle the key to the way that you look at things, it makes you intolerant of any risks. So what happens is you feminize the society and you create government programs that are built on being afraid of everything. And what you don't realize is that there are all kinds of things that have risks involved, So, but the point is, adults learn how to deal with risk management, and precautionary principle is not a good risk management tool. If you can't tolerate any risks, then you can't do anything. You're paralyzed. And what these environmentalists have done is taken advantage of people's tendency to look at the precautionary principle as a really good thing to do. We can't take any risks like that. The children might be harmed. So anything that you say is a risk has got to be dealt with. And that's when the government comes in, and politicians and regulators and the science people that are paid by the government love that kind of situation, because then they can start telling you how to live. They can tell you whether modern developments in all kinds of things like combustion engines could be dangerous. And so we have to do something to control what these combustion engines are doing. And if you've got a list of scares, you've got an opportunity for lots of regulations. And that's what oligarchs like to do. They like to regulate and tell people how to live. And so they use the science as a weapon. Okay, well, you're in favor of the children, aren't you? Well, this could kill the children. Take a look. Ozone could cause child illnesses that are terrible, like asthma. Well, excuse me, but ozone is not an allergen. It doesn't cause asthma. They even put people in chambers and fed them extra ozone to see if they could make them sick or make them have problems breathing, and they couldn't do it. But that didn't change the fact that they said, oh yeah, ozone. And everybody who got upset about the LA basin and how terrible it looked when the air pollution was gathering in that basin like it has for centuries. So all you have to do is say, well, ozone is one of the factors that makes the LA basin look terrible. And that air that looks terrible has got to be harmful. So we're going to put together some research that shows that. And in the case of warming, the same sort of thing was done. They decided, well, we can make sure that people really understand why we have to control carbon dioxide, because we can show them that carbon dioxide makes the planet warmer, and it's going to eventually kill the population of humans and destroy the planet. And if we don't do something now, we've got to crash. Well, how many crises now have we gone through since you and I were younger? Well, in 10 years, the carbon dioxide level is going to be enough that the planet is really going to come apart. A great piece of news yesterday. I don't know whether you saw this, Tom, or not, but the report was out that this year is the first year in 10 years when there were no hurricanes that breached the coast of the United States. So
I hadn't seen that.
in the midst, oh yeah, the news came out yesterday. You can't imagine how happy I was to see that, because what it did was it proved what people on our side have said all along. If the planet warms, the laws of thermodynamics and the observations of meteorologists are that it will reduce violent weather, because violent weather is created by cold and hot air masses meeting someplace and creating havoc. That's what happens. That's the reason why there's a certain time of the year that hurricanes come, because it's cold and warm air masses that create turbulence, and the turbulence gets amplified by the circumstances of the cold and hot air masses. Well, the same thing happens with tornadoes or thunderstorms. It's about cold and hot meeting. So when you add energy to the climate and the average temperature goes up a little bit, it reduces the amount of cold air masses at night and during the day. And that means there are less opportunities for cold air masses to meet with hot air masses and create violent weather like tornadoes, windstorms, blizzards, all the things that the left the environmentalists try to point to as a reason why we need to make sure we control carbon dioxide.
So how about these articles I see every once in a while that says, we have to crack down on certain anesthetic gases because they're super polluters and they cause bad weather. Do you think there are quite a few people in the medical community that actually believe that?
Belief is a good point, a good word to use. If you put a scientist in a situation where he knows that the group think is in favor of one or another scientific hypothesis, it only takes a little bit to buy their brain and make them believe all kinds of things, right?
Yes.
No, so Eisenhower warned us of the government research problem. The government research complex was one of his warnings in the farewell speech, along with the military industrial complex. What he was saying was, when money is involved, corruption starts. And that's what's happened to the scientific community around the world. It's everywhere. And the money makes the difference, and scientists are like everybody else. When they come home at night, their wife says, "Well, how are things going?" And I'd like to live in a bigger house, or I'd like to buy a new car. Are you doing well? And if the government is the source of money for researchers, what do you think it takes to buy a researcher who's going to say what the government or the oligarchs would like them to say? They're whores. And I meet whores all the time. It's easy to become a whore if you're trying to get ahead, right? And in science, you get ahead if you get research money from the government. And that means you better be speaking what the government says. It's Harvard. Harvard is the center of junk science because they're the place where they get the most money from the government to do the things that the government wants them to do. And so my targets in the last 30 years have been the research people, because what they do is they create the excuses that the oligarchs want to regulate and to control people's lives, and maybe even control economies, all kinds of things. You're in the business of pushing back. So I'm telling you things that you already know.
So, from your perspective, when you look ahead, do you think if we have an administration or two that does not fund climate scam science, do you think that'll have any sort of ongoing effect?
Oh, tremendous. It'll change things completely. You know, Trump has already disrupted what had become a very good deal that had been created between what you might call the intellectual research academic class and the government with their administrative state. You know, the thing that people don't understand is there's an administrative state that runs the show. These politicians are elected, and the bureaucrats, they look even at the guys that are against what they're doing, and they say, well, he'll be gone in a few years, and we're still going to be here. And so they do the best they can to make sure that nobody screws up their little arrangement, where everybody gets paid lots of money to do research that helps to support what the administrative state wants to do. And what you got is people that are going in and out of the administrative state. You know, it's the same thing that happens with the military industrial complex. So I'm a general now, but next year I could be on the board of an outfit that makes bombs or planes. So I'm going to do what the bombs or planes people want, because I want to make sure there's a good spot for me when I move out of the government. The same thing happens with the EPA. There's a revolving door, and everybody knows about it in Washington. But out here, there are an awful lot of people who don't realize these researchers that are producing the research that's used by the EPA, they're owned by the EPA, because the money that they need for research comes from the EPA directing money towards them for research. And the result is academic institutions are whorehouses for people that work for the government. It's the way things happen. And people are pretty naive to think that it won't make a difference whether somebody's putting $1 million in your bank account when you move out of the EPA and you become some kind of a person that can expedite things for the industries that the EPA has been paying a lot of paying a lot to do, or industries that want to make sure that they have a good relationship to the EPA, because the EPA is the entity that can make a difference as to whether they're doing well or not. There are other things that happen because of the EPA too, but the EPA handles a lot of money.
Do you think right now we're just in sort of a hiatus of the climate scam, though, and when the next left-wing administration comes in, they're going to totally revive it back the way it was 4 years ago, or not?
They would if they could. We are really in debt to Donald Trump for what he's done. And nobody can tell me that he hasn't changed the game. And nobody can tell me that if a Democrat like Kamala had gotten in, that we would be back into the same stuff that was going on during Biden and Obama. And they were basically, they were the evolution of leftists, socialists, globalists, ideological tyrants. Orwell was no stoop. Since he was a socialist, he understood the idea of overreaching government and tyranny, and he wrote about it. I'm not exactly sure what motivated him. He was talking about things that, in fact, he was a part of as being terrible and evil. A boot on the face of humanity forever. What a brilliant guy. Sad that he was not very healthy, but I'm glad he was around because he certainly did a whole lot of things to try to make sure that people were warned about what can happen when you've got oligarchs deciding how people should live.
So as a separate issue from the climate scam issue, do you have strong opinions on this whole, is it a PM 2.5 issue? I think Steve Malloy talks about that a lot, about how dangerous are those tiny particles to humans?
Be still my heart. You can't believe how much time I've spent trying to prove that these people are just lying about small particles. Small particles is nothing more than something that's really small. Could be dust. And diesel emissions have small particles in them. So the game was, let's make small particles deadly. And I can tell you a few stories that might be worthwhile knowing about. People need to know these things. So if you remember, I told you I started off in the early 90s looking at what the EPA was doing. I saw what Hansen was doing with regards to climate, but I also was very interested in what Browner, who was the EPA administrator, was doing with regards to small particles. And what they did was they ginned up this research where they would have air monitors in regions, and they would match up the air monitor information with the death rates in the region. Now, that's not toxicology. That's just playing with numbers. In order to do toxicology, what you have to do is you have to expose somebody to something that you think might have a toxic effect. Control the exposure, watch what happens, and compare it to populations that aren't exposed. That's toxicology. The EPA never did anything like that with regards to small particles. They did population studies of large areas. And what they would do is they would dig through the data that was available either spatially or temporally. Okay, so what you do is you say, we're going to watch this population for 10 years. Okay. Then what you do is you find out what you can find out with regards to the information on death rates and pollution rates for a particular time or space that works for you. It's called data dredging. And it's the tool of epidemiologists who cheat. They don't control the populations, they don't control the exposures, but they try to match up numbers, and they teach their computers to look for the numbers that work for their argument. So what those computers do is they match up monitor information on air pollution with death rates in a population. Okay. And then what they try to do is they say, as compared to the death rate in the population, the death rate in these people that are exposed to this monitor level of air pollution are dying at a higher rate. And you would say, well, okay, that's kind of like science. And then there are some rules, epidemiology rules that were declared by a guy named Bradford Hill, Sir Bradford Hill of England. And Bradford Hill was an epidemiologist who established that smoking cigarettes causes cancer. It was his, what you might say, his life's work, and it was something that he did based upon good toxicology. He controlled the exposure, and he looked at the cancer rate, and he said, holy cow, the cancer rate is much higher for people who are smoking cigarettes. Well, in effect, you could say, well, Bradford, you really weren't that great a scientist. Hell, people knew that cancer sticks. Cigarettes were called cancer sticks a long time before Bradford Hill got his study done and his research done. It was enough of an effect that everybody who was around and alive would say, yeah, that guy smokes a lot. He's going to get lung cancer, because that's what happened. You know, John Wayne. I mean, the ultimate big guy, the ultimate tough guy. So John Wayne smokes his cigarettes all his life and he gets lung cancer. You can't, even if you're a big, strong movie star, you can't take away the fact that cigarettes cause cancer. Well, Bradford Hill, because he's an epidemiologist, had a set of 8 criteria that the EPA never uses. And one of the criteria, the most important one, in my opinion, is the magnitude of the effect of what we're studying. So the magnitude of effect essentially is nothing more than, if in the regular control population, the death rate is X, then the magnitude of effect has to be at least more than twice. Now, that's not much. Let's just say that the death rate in the United States is 2 per 1,000. It means that in order to make a claim that something causes people to die more than the regular population, has to be shown by an increase in the rate of death to 4 or a little more. Some people say, yeah, you know, that's on the edge. Let's say 3 or more. So you'd have to go 2 more. You'd have to go to 6. EPA never did that. All of their research showed a death rate that was an increase of less than 2. Almost 1. But the point is, it wasn't enough to say this causes death or this causes cancer. So a lady named Gina McCarthy, who was EPA administrator, and you know her name because you've been in this thing for a long time. She goes to Congress in 2011 and says to Congress, small particles kill 300,000 plus Americans every year. That's based on junk science that essentially had to data dredge in order to find something a little bit more than no effect at all. Certainly not enough to say there was 2 or 3 times the rate of death of the population that was not exposed to the small particle levels that we say are toxic and need to be regulated. Now, since you've been at it a long time, you know that what I'm telling you is the way that they handle this. They created a scare by jacking with the science, and everybody said, oh yeah, because, you know, I was looking at the LA basin the other day and it looked terrible. That stuff's got to be killing people. Well, dust storms and other things. How about the Smoky Mountains? Smoky Mountains look lethal, don't they? To somebody who thinks that any haze has got to be something that's going to kill people. Well, toxicology is a little tougher than that. You better show me the toxic effect, the death effect. But the EPA has been lying for 30 years. That's really it's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. You know, you got people at Harvard who've been pouring out small particle research for years and years. It was nothing more than temporal spatial jacking with the numbers, data dredging, and then putting up studies that might have a relative risk of 1.2. Well, remember what I said. You got to be at least 2 to be able to say anything. And some people, including Marcia Angel, who was I'll just give you an example. Marcia Angel was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine for a few years. And she declared that, as far as she was concerned, the toxicologists needed to show her a relative risk of 3 or more in order for her to believe that something was actually toxic. Now, if the EPA has been getting away with that kind of crap for so long, how is it that there weren't politicians and just regular people who didn't say, ho, 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 because of the media and because of the government? The government wanted to control things that produce small particles. California wanted to do something about diesel engines. So a little lie, and you get to make a regulation.
So
It's a great scam. There are a lot of people made a lot of living. They made a living off of doing research that helped to support what the EPA wanted to do. And if they had to lie a little bit, so what with the Bradford Hill rules? We're on a mission. Our mission is to do something about these combustion engines, the gas ones and the diesel ones. I don't know. This is so much fun. The problem is I shouldn't have so much fun dealing with something that is such a terrible policy mistake that's been going on now for decades.
you think there's some dynamic where the human lung can handle small particles, but maybe like for Brent's lung, are those particles way bigger for the black lung?
No. Let's talk about black lung. I had a good friend that was involved with the small particle thing, who was a pulmonologist in West Virginia. Hey, that's a pretty good start. Well, the fact is that what we discussed in many cases was the fact that sure, black lung is a terrible disease because these people they're inhaling particulates that are big and can cause mechanical damage. It's not the small particles in the coal dust that's the culprit. I'll give you an just to kind of reinforce what's going on. There were 3 major air pollution catastrophes in the history of the human race over the last century. First one was in Belgium. The second one was in Pennsylvania. And the third one was in London. And in both the Belgian and Pennsylvania air pollution events that killed dozens of people. It wasn't like they killed millions of people. They killed a bunch of people in a relatively small city in Pennsylvania. And in the Belgium situation, they killed less than 24 people. But it was air pollution that everybody agreed was probably the cause of the problem, because these people got sick when they went outside and were exposed to this air. Well, the air in Belgium, Pennsylvania, and London was special. And it was created because of inversions. Inversions are a meteorological phenomenon where a layer of air traps the layer of air near the ground. And in the case of all 3 of these things, it trapped air that was polluted with high levels of sulfuric acid and other acids in the case of Belgium and Pennsylvania. And in the case of London, it was black coal dust. Those things cause people to have lung disease. There's no denying that. But that doesn't translate to what the EPA did, which was to say, all that dust and all that haze, it looks ugly, but guess what? It's killing people. We need to regulate it. Lies. They didn't have any research that showed that. And then we say, well, people, what about those people that died in London? Well, it's the dose and it's the nature of the toxin that people should have been paying attention to. And small particles never were and never will be deadly. But Gina McCarthy said to the Congress they killed 300,000 Americans every year. That's almost as much as cancer kills people in a year in the United States. So it's bound to get everybody upset. And it's diesel engines. That's the cause. That's the cause. And dust is also the cause, because we need to, we can't discriminate. We have to say any small particle is lethal, deadly, but our target is diesel engines. That's what we want to control. And I got involved in this to some extent politically because I wrote a paper around 2004, 2005 for the American College of Science and Health, ACSH. It's a New York organization that's what you would call easily described as conservative, on the conservative end of the political spectrum. And I wrote a 2-part article on the small particle scam. And a guy named John Samet, who was a prominent epidemiologist, physician from Johns Hopkins. And what I wrote about was the legal implications of John Samet's junk science and claims, and the scientific reasons why the claims were terrible and were nothing but lies. And a guy named Jim Enstrom, who'd been doing research on air pollution and secondhand smoke, called me up and he said, I read your papers. They were damn good. I'm involved in a fight with the California EPA. Will you help? And so I spent a number of years going in and out of the California situation and presenting to the California EPA when they had their public hearings and trying to fight what their effort was, which was to control diesel engines and do something to industry that was excused by the fact that they were going to save the planet and save California from small particles. And of course, that was a lie. It was a lie created by research that California paid people to do. And guess what? The EPA arranged for the California regs to become regs that control the whole United States. Other people who didn't believe that this small particle stuff was real were in effect, they were pushed out of the way. It is doing the right thing. And we're going to support them by making sure that their regs are considered to be appropriate and that they can control by interstate travel and interstate commerce what can be done with engines. It all piles up, doesn't it?
So I haven't dug into this very much, but it says here on AI, black coal dust particles range from 50 to 200 microns in diameter. Would those be particles that you could inhale, and those would be dangerous at that size, or no?
You can inhale big particles like that, and what we're talking about with regards to small particles is 2.5, and so you can see that's a tremendous difference, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, you put big particles from something like that, from pollutant, coal, into a lung, it's going to collect on the airways and it's going to cause disease. There's just no denying that. And when you think of toxicology, you have to think in terms of dose. Yep. and the nature of the toxin. And there's just so much junk science that's been created around junk epidemiology that it's hard to even, and most people would, but they'd be breathless trying to deal with all the things that I could show them have been a part of what is nothing more than people taking advantage of the precautionary principle and cheating on the toxicology. It's a disgrace. And you know, doctors, you were asking me earlier on about doctors. The performance of the medical profession in the matter of COVID should remind people that doctors are like, they're like all people involved in academics and science and professional activities. They're susceptible. They've been successful in classrooms all their lives. So they want the world to be like a classroom where they get credit for being smart and finishing their schooling and getting tested and licensed and become important people. And then they become intellectuals who lead the world and all that other stuff. So doctors who find a way to succeed oftentimes find that way by doing what the oligarchs want them to do. What do you think is the reason why there are so many doctors that were doing what Anthony Fauci told them to do? Because that would work out well for them. And that permeates professional organizations. Legal organizations like the bar associations, they're owned lock, stock, and barrel by the administrative state and the socialist ideological army that is so prevalent in modern society. The same is true of medical organizations. They are corrupt. They are not ethical, and they certainly don't hold to a scientific method approach to things. They decide what's good from a political point of view, and then they make the science fit.
I think I might have heard you mention that some of this EPA type science is kind of cargo cult science. It sort of looks like science, but it's not. And it's like the whole idea that you can correlate ice cream sales and shark attacks. Therefore, ice cream sales cause shark attacks.
Well, it's called bad science in some people's mind. But cargo cult science is a phrase that describes the kind of junk science that these people do. And I don't know whether he coined it as a phrase, but there was a guy named Richard Feynman who was a Nobel laureate in physics. Richard Feynman was an extraordinary man. He was also a very interesting guy. He was, there's no way, he was unique and a great teacher. And he, in a speech that he gave to the Caltech graduation in like 1993 or 1994 or something like that. By that time, I think he was already a Nobel laureate for physics on what amounts to something that I don't even understand, electromagnetic spectrum and stuff like that. But Richard Feynman was a famous and accomplished individual. And what he told that graduating class was about cargo cult science. And the example that he used was people who lived on primitive islands in the south and east of Asia. And during the Second World War, these islands were used as airfields for the modern armies that were having it out in that area below China and between the Asian continent and Australia. And so these primitive tribes would see what was going on in the airfields, and it included people who landed planes and distributed goods to the residents of the island, the tribe members, and they were benefiting from the fact that these airfields were on their island. And when the World War ended, they would put up little models of the airfield with the idea that they could replicate the presence of these advanced people that were giving them things. And so Feynman said the delusion that they had was that they could do it like it looked like was going to achieve the same thing that actually was, because of the fact that these were modern armies that were able to do things that were real, not just. It's kind of like the Potemkin villages that that Russia created to create the illusion that they had a successful society, but in fact it was just a plain lie. And the cargo cult science is nothing more than science lying presented as good science in order to create an effect and in order to create some kind of an advantage. And in this case, what we have is a whole army of junk scientists who are doing cargo cult science, stuff that they know is a lie because they've got a political goal in mind, an agenda.
Do you want
Sort of
to?
sad, isn't it?
It is. It is. Do you want to talk a little bit about the paper you released less than a year ago with David Legates?
Yeah, well, we did a kind of a comprehensive look that was nothing more than an accumulation of things that I had been doing for maybe 10 or 15 years. And it was about the idea that a warmer planet, in fact, was not a bad thing. It was a good thing, particularly in the range of warming that was being talked about by the EPA as being something that would kill the planet and destroy the planet. And Mother Gaia was going to just suffer so much. And what they were saying, well, we've projected that there will be an increase because of an accumulation of carbon dioxide. The population will be subjected to the effects of an increase of carbon dioxide that is catastrophic. And they had a whole list of things that would happen. People would die of heat stroke. Cities would be inundated by a rise in the sea level. There would be all kinds of bad things that would happen, bad weather. Okay. So what I did was I said, okay, really, when it comes down to it, these people are saying warming is going to kill people, and it's lethal and it's harmful. Well, I grew up in Iowa. I went to high school in Wisconsin, and I live in Texas. There's a reason. Living in a winter in Minnesota or Iowa or Siberia is damn tough. It's hard on you. And as you get older, it gets harder. That's the reason why there is a thing called snowbirds. I met a snowbird once when I was on a boat out of a Mexican city in the middle of the winter, and we were going to an island to visit and look at the island. And I was standing there on the boat with him, and I asked him where he was from, and he said, well, I'm from Montreal. I said, well, I noticed you're here in Mexico. And he said, you damn betcha, because living in Canada in the winter is misery. Well, there's a reason why. If you're living in a climate that is cold when you go outside, you're subjected to temperatures that cause your body to react. And the reaction is that your peripheral blood vessels contract in order to preserve the heat in your core, keep you alive. Well, the contraction of those blood vessels causes blood to sludge. Sludged blood gets clots. Clots can kill. So if you look at the studies, and one of the studies that was the most important because it basically did all the things that I had been trying to teach people warming is about. It showed that deaths from cold spells are higher than deaths from warm spells by 17 times. Now that's clearly an order of magnitude that should be paid attention to. But the people that were in charge of scaring people about warming, all they could talk about were the heat wave deaths in Chicago in the 90s and in France a little bit later. Well, there are reasons for that. One is Chicago didn't have much in the way of air conditioning, and the people that died were people who lived in relatively hostile housing situations, who had medical problems that kept them from getting out and kept them from being properly hydrated. And as a result, they died because of the heat. And the same is true in France. And the reason was there was a unique reason for that. That's that in France and the rest of Europe, they take the month of August off. So they go to the beach and the old folks are left behind. And they died from neglect. And so the Gasparini study in 2014 showed this terrible difference in deaths caused by heat or by cold as compared to deaths caused by warm. And since then, subsequent studies have showed that because people became conscious of heat wave deaths, they've been dramatically decreased in Europe because it's easy to mitigate. You don't have heat wave deaths in the tropics. So somebody should have said, okay, hold a minute. We're saying that heat is a terrible thing. It kills all these people. How come it kills people in the mid latitudes where a heat wave is temperature of 100 as compared to the tropics where the temperatures hover in the 90s and 100s all the time? Well, it's because people are smart enough to get in the shade, make sure that they drink plenty of water, use a little hand fan if that's all they've got. Even if they don't have air conditioning, they're not going to die. Whereas people in Europe and people in the United States who lived in moderate climes, because the heat wave deaths were not deaths in Texas or Florida. They were heat wave deaths in places where they usually have decently cool weather in most of the year, and the heat waves are kind of unique. And you know, it's, if somebody had looked at it, they would have said, oh, come on. The heat wave deaths in Chicago were because they have bad housing and no air conditioning. End of story. And the same is true of if they looked at the deaths in France. But it was the beginning of the big campaign. Warming kills all these sad people that, if you look at it, they were often people who had more than one medical problem. And so as a result, and in fact, if you look at it as an epidemiologist, what you could see was a death rate that increased. And then after that, it declined below the normal level because of what's called the harvesting effect. So the heat would take out the people who are probably going to be a part of the deaths that would happen after the increase in deaths, and the trough was caused by the fact that those people weren't around to die. they were already gone. Something to think about. If you look at death rates in places that are really cold, you can see the problem. Strokes, heart attacks, blood clots, infections, respiratory infections increase when your lungs are exposed to cold air. And asthma is aggravated by cold air. So there are a lot of things that happen when the temperature declines, and you have to say, okay, is the earth a hospitable place based upon what the average temperature is? You say, well, what's the average temperature of the earth? It's 59 degrees. That's what, it's hard to do an average for a big place like the planet Earth, but that's what they've calculated. So it's around 59 degrees. Go outside in 59-degree weather and do it in shorts and a t-shirt and tell me how long you're going to last. Something to think about. Okay, so it was easy for me to give a lecture at the Heartland Institute meetings. Nobody thinks that 59 degrees is warm enough so that you can just say, hey, this is not bad. I like this. Anybody with good sense would say, well, 59 degrees isn't very hospitable. What's it like if it goes to 10 below? That's not even a close call. Everybody would say, oh, well, it's such a terrible thing. We have heat waves that the temperature went to 105 or 110. How about the people who live in deserts where the temperatures are easily that high and it's dry air? How is it that they survive? Why aren't there heat wave death epidemics in the tropics around the planet? I mean, it's nonsense. If you've ever been in a hot place, I've lived in Texas for a long time. I worked for the Army for 14 years in Fort Hood, which is not far from where I live, but it's in the middle of Texas, and it gets very hot every day during the summer. And in what we consider to be really hot is 110. What we consider to be mildly hot is in the upper 90s and lower hundreds. And what you do is you go inside during the middle of the day, get out of the direct sunlight, get in the shade, put on the air conditioner, make sure that you drink plenty of fluids. And if you have medical problems, make sure those people are in a place where they're not going to be exposed to an extended period of very hot climate where they're living, and they don't die from the fact that they got dehydrated and got heat illness. Most people don't know much about heat illness as opposed to cold illness. The clot thing, I've already explained. The question of heat illness, it hits two groups. People who are medically in trouble for one reason or another, and people who are exercising and active in hot weather and don't watch for the signs of heat illness, which are initially you get kind of weak, you feel terrible, and what you need to do is sit down and drink some water and get out of the sun. But beyond that, heat illness causes the core temperature of your body to rise. And that's because people, if they are exposed to heat and they're not doing something about it, they don't have mechanisms to prevent the increase in the core temperature. What's the increase in the core temperature? Two things. You radiate heat from your body if you're in a place where it isn't as hot as your body is. And the second thing is evaporation. If you sweat, everything that you sweat evaporates. And when it evaporates, the chemist will tell you that it releases a lot of heat. So it's a cooling mechanism. very much like what we call the swamp coolers. The swamp cooler is not an air conditioner, but it produces cool air. And the way it does it is you have a body of water in a tub, and you blow air across the top of the tub so that water evaporates into the air. And as it evaporates, it cools the air that's going over the top of the swamp cooler. Guess what? That's what happens on the planet. And that's the reason why water and air movement are important for modulating heat. And that's why deserts get so damn hot. No water. They have plenty of wind, but no water. So it allows the sand to get extremely hot, and the environment of the desert is going to be extremely hot because of the conditions of the environment. That's why tropical climates are not so bad, because most of the tropics doesn't have a desert situation. It's in fact, you look at the Amazon, you say, there's nothing deserty about that place. It's all full of greenery, and there's plenty of water vapor going up and down in places around the globe that are tropical, where the heat is there. The sun is shining really bright, but the temperatures don't get that much out of control, so that you don't have a temperature of 120 or 130 in the tropics because of evaporation. That's the way that you handle. That's called mitigation, and that's the reason why I always thought this is silly. I've been miserable in Wisconsin in the middle of the winter, but I've never been miserable in Texas. If it gets too hot, you go inside, or you get in the shade. Use a hand fan.
All right.
I don't know. Maybe all of this is too much fun for you and me.
Yeah, it is very fun. No, you're doing a great job of adding sanity to the debate. So I appreciate what you're doing. We are up to near the end of our hour here. Do you have more points you want to make before we finish up?
Ooh. The scientific method. Everybody claims that they know what the scientific method is. I belong to the National Association of Scholars. They have decided they're going to promote a science curriculum to teach kids how to do science right. Right at the same time, the National Academy of Sciences has announced that they are working on the same kind of a curriculum, and they're going to promote science. The National Academy of Science is the home of junk science. It is a sad thing that I saw that in the news this past week. The National Academy of Science was assigned an investigative committee in around 2014 to study the claim that was made by some people in that the EPA was sponsoring research, human research, that was a violation of the Nuremberg Code and the Helsinki Accords on human experimentation. What they were doing is they had found 10 medical schools and 6 domestic medical schools and paid them to put people in chambers and pump diesel exhaust into those chambers to see if they could make people sick. You can see that's illegal. It's unethical. It's immoral. How many things do you have to say about that? But 10 medical schools, and I'm not talking about, medical schools somewhere these are prominent medical schools, UCLA, University of Michigan, the big medical schools, the prominent medical schools. They were doing this research, and we found out about it. Steve Malloy was the guy that really found out about it, but I was jumping on it as soon as I heard anything from, and we eventually made so much noise that the Congress said to the Inspector General of the EPA, you got to do something. What's going on here? They paid 10 medical schools to do human research where they pumped stuff into a chamber where they were breathing stuff that they said was causing cancer and killing 300,000 people a year in the United States alone. The National Academy of Science has what's called a national research. They have a sidearm that does research. They had 20 members assigned to be on the committee, and we were supposed to present our arguments to them about how this was unethical and illegal and immoral. And so we all got together, and finally, after a year of them doing some preliminary research, we had a hearing. Lasted about 2 or 3 hours. And they didn't ask a question at the end of the hearing. And then they went away and said, well, you know, the EPA was doing something, but we're going to give them a pass on this because the research was on something that, in fact, didn't really kill people, even though they said it killed people. I'm sorry, I got a dog on the porch. But the point is, they don't have the integrity to do a good curriculum for the schools. And the science curriculum that needs to be done is to teach people that if you don't do an experiment to prove up the theory that you have, if you don't test it to make sure that you don't have a silly idea, then it's not good science. And here's what the National Academy of Science wants. They want a standard that says if the majority of the scientists think that this is true, that's enough. It's called the consensus fallacy. It's called the authority fallacy. Fallacy is bad science. And the National Academy of Science supports consensus science, which is junk science. There are other things to say about the scientific method, but the most important thing is Karl Popper said it right. If you can't falsify your thesis, your hypothesis, then it's not good science. And Einstein said, one experiment can prove even the most elegant theory to be wrong. And the National Academy of Science doesn't want that to happen. If you don't teach people that science requires that you do experiments to find out the validity of your theory or your hypothesis, you're going to end up with a scientific community that's putting out junk all the time. That is probably the most important thing to know about the scientific method. Experiments are essential. And the experiment that proves your theory to be false is dispositive, as they say in the legal community, which means it settles the question. An experiment that proves a theory incorrect is the controlling scientific action, and it's being ignored constantly by people all the way up to the top in places like Harvard. And the National Academy of Science just formalized it because they're made up of the people that end up being important scientists at places like Harvard. They would never let me in the National Academy of Science, I can assure you, Mr. Nelson.
Sounds right.
I would blow up their scam. They wouldn't let you in either. I can assure you.
100% sure. All right. We'll wrap up here, but thanks a ton for what you're doing. This time flew by. I really appreciate it.
Well, it was fun, of course, and I hope that I gave you something that was worth your time.
100% you did. Yep. Thanks a lot. We'll talk to you next time.
I had a good time. Thank you.